contract that will be delivered. So we're trying to have early delivery dates for the donations that have been committed by the advanced economies. And we need to know what the type of vaccine is and where it's going to be delivered so we can work on the hesitancy problem.
Right, okay. Tedros, you and I have been talking vaccine inequality for over 12 months. Progress with respect to all of you has been painfully slow. I know you know that. Firstly, are these donations enough, sir?
Yeah, thank you, Becky. The donations are not enough. And to be honest, as you said, very slow. Plus, it's very disappointing that it's taking so long for the world to really commit. Because epidemiologically, it's wrong because we cannot end this pandemic. Economically, it's wrong because the economy globally is not recovering. And also morally is wrong. And, there should be a political commitment to address this problem. As you have rightly said, if you take low-income countries, it's only 4%. And if you take it in another way, 70% of the delivery is just to 10 countries. That's completely unfair. And, this will not end the pandemic. And it's in the interest of all countries, rich, poor, or middle income, to end this pandemic. And that's why, together with my colleagues in the task force, we are saying there is a 40% by the end of this year target and 70% by mid next year. We have to, especially G20 countries should own those targets and make it happen, because more than 80% of the economy belongs to them, and the bulk of the production capacity also belongs to them. If there is political commitment and they want to do it, they can do it. So that's what we're asking.
That's the big question, though, isn't it, sir? That's the big question. Is there political commitment? Stand by. I just want to bring our other two guests in tonight. Let's be quite clear about this. Ngozi, let me start with you. Just how realistic are these targets at this point? We are talking at least 40% of people in every country vaccinated by the end of 2021 and at least 60% by mid-2022. We are way away from those levels at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Becky. I think that with these targets, yes, we are well away. You can see the numbers that you just talked about, 4% in low-income countries versus over 60% in rich countries. But if you can see the progress that can be made in countries when they have access to these vaccines and where the ability to distribute them and get them into arms is there. So I think if we decide as a community that we can do this, we will do it. We're very far away from where we need to be, but we need to ramp up now because, as Tedros said, it's just not acceptable that we have this gap. So let's get the vaccines delivered quickly. We have countries waiting to put these vaccines into arms. Let's get them delivered and we may be able to achieve this target. It's very ambitious given where we are now, but it's not impossible.
Kristalina, stand by, because I do want to get your perspective on this. But the cold, hard fact, according to Amnesty International, out of the nearly 6 billion COVID-19 doses delivered worldwide, a paltry 0.3% have gone to low-income countries. And at this point, I just want to draw on some CNN reporting to underscore the challenge here. Let's look at Africa, for example. Stand by.
I'm David McKenzie in Johannesburg. If you look around me, life seems to be getting back to normal. But this country, this region has suffered through a devastating COVID-19 pandemic. The big issue now, to avoid future waves, is, of course, vaccines. Vaccine nationalism and vaccine hoarding has really hurt the efforts for an equitable access across the world, particularly in Africa, for COVID-19 vaccines. the African continent, there are far less than 10% of people who've received their full complement of COVID-19 vaccines, even as rich countries are giving booster shots to their most vulnerable. Now the issue is, as manufacturers ramp up vaccination production, can the money and the resources be made available to get vaccines out to nations on the African continent, or can there be a deal made on dropping intellectual property of those vaccines? All I can say is, through all my reporting on this issue, is the talk of solidarity has largely been talk. Now it's time for action.
Kristalina, get the money and resources to where they matter most is David's appeal. What is being done to address finance and trade barriers to ensure that vulnerable populations get these life-saving tools?
Thank you very much for bringing us together, Becky. What we have seen is much more awareness of the economic significance of overcoming this great vaccination divide. And that awareness is slowly translating in more willingness to act. So what do we know? We know that the world economy is recovering, but risks are going up, and the divergence in economic fortunes is expanding. Why that matters to advanced economies, to rich countries? Because if part of the world continues to be slow to recover, held back by lack of access to vaccines, by limited fiscal space, that not only causes supply disruptions, and these supply disruptions are one of the factors pushing prices up, but it also creates space for new variants of COVID to flourish and run around the world. We have done very careful analysis that says for $50 billion, we can achieve the target of vaccinating 40% by the end of this year, 70% actually. Tedros lifted it up to 70% target by mid-2022. Of this 50 billion, we now see more than close to 2/3 being made available. But we still have a gap to fill. What are we doing? I want to praise the World Bank for stepping up. They are now willing and able to secure 20 billion in financing. We at the IMF provided the largest in our history allocation of the so-called special drawing rights, the reserve asset of the IMF that gives countries fiscal space. Where are the bottlenecks? I do strongly believe that there are two. One, it is timely allocation of vaccines to developing countries. If a rich country doesn't need the vaccines in November, can receive them in February, move the delivery in November to the developing world. And secondly, and this is where it is so important we work together, getting a vial, a vaccine, to turn into a shot in the arm. And in many poor countries, it is this getting the vaccine from the tarmac where it is stored to the child or the woman or the man in a village up in the mountains. That is the toughest part of this delivery. I want to answer your question honestly. Can we get to 40% everywhere? This is going to be tough. But can we get much closer to 40% everywhere and at or more than 40% in many countries? Yes, the vaccines are produced. We have to make sure they get where they would make a difference.
Would a decision by the developed world to advise booster shots to its populations prevent you as a task force from achieving your goal? David.
I don't think that's the key issue. The production is going up so rapidly, there may be enough to do boosters and to reach targets in 2022. The key thing that I would emphasize is for finance ministers in countries and their health ministers to seek contracts, to try to get delivery dates that are early and to ask for them and to request them. And then for the advanced economies to go along with that, to help get the early delivery dates. I was in Sudan. Well, let me mention two things. J&J doses are particularly valuable in Africa. Europe has committed to shipping doses to J&J doses to Africa. Complete that so that the people can have those doses. I was in Khartoum and in Amman last week, and they're vaccinating people day by day. The hesitancy is going down as once people have vaccines, and if they have the syringes and the needles that can be brought in with the shipments of the doses, then the people are being vaccinated. So that part of the system is working, but we need more clear delivery dates from the various sources. World Bank has 61 countries that have programs with us, and we can expand that to 100 countries if the countries ask for doses and arrange for getting the contracts set up in an accountable way. That's key.
Tedros, I have to get you to give us your perspective at this point on boosters.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. On boosters, I will again go back to the figures because the world should understand the inequity, the injustice. As I said earlier, 6.5 billion doses have already been administered. And of this, Africa got only 166 million. 166 million for 1.2 billion people. And the rest, 6.3 billion, is for the rest of the world. Then I can show you in a different way. For instance, if you take South America, North America, Europe, Asia, Oceania, as a region, all of them are above 50%, at least single dose, while Africa is only 7% single dose, or 4.8%. So as a region, the focus should be that. Then bringing it back to boosters, when there is only 166 million delivered in Africa for 1.2 billion, to start booster is really the worst we could do as global community. It's unjust and also unfair, because we will not stop this pandemic by ignoring the whole continent, and the continent which doesn't have any manufacturing capacity or other means. So the world should come back to its senses. I don't want to spread it by saying all low-income countries. The concentration of the problem is in one continent. Let's take that first. So on boosters, for countries to move into boosters without even providing single doses in Africa is not right.
Ngozi.
So it has to be stopped, and countries should respect the moratorium. Of course, there are exceptions. You know, we can use it in immunocompromised populations, immunocompromised. The rest, it's immoral, unfair, unjust, and it has to stop.
Ngozi and Kristalina, I must get your perspective on this. Ngozi, briefly.
Well, briefly, I think one of the ways to solve this inequity of access, which I agree totally with Tedros, is unacceptable, is to decentralize production. If we are going to continue needing boosters and things like that, it's evident that we need to decentralize production to some of the countries that have no capacity. And on the African continent, 17% of the world population, 0.2% of the manufacturing capacity. We cannot continue importing 99% of our vaccines. So at the WTO, we've actually been working with manufacturers of these vaccines to try and help them with their supply chain problems, monitoring where there are bottlenecks so that they can be able to increase production. And at the same time, working with them to encourage them to set up manufacturing in emerging markets and developing countries. And I think, Becky, that is yielding some fruit. We've now heard an announcement by Pfizer of investment in
Sure.
South Africa and Aspen, and we've heard of Moderna is just saying that it's going to set up some production facilities on the continent. But we need to get the capacity to produce.
The three leading vaccine manufacturers, BioNTech, Moderna and Pfizer, could net $130 billion by the end of this year. Ngozi, you're right. We have seen some progress in manufacturing plants being set up. But are these manufacturers prolonging this pandemic by putting profits before people?
You know, we hear a lot about the profits before people. And obviously, if you look at their numbers, it is true that, you know, they're earning far more than they ever have. That's why we're working with them to say, look, the perception of this profits before the lives of people is neither good publicly for you, nor for everyone, nor for anyone. So we're working with them to really try to get partnerships on the continent, in Latin America as well, in low-income countries, so that they can demonstrate that, look, for them, it's not profits, but it's people. You know, it's coming along. I think we need the manufacturers, because without them, we're not going to be able to manufacture vaccines. Vaccines are complicated. You need the technology transfer, the know-how, to be able to do it, along with the issues of intellectual property. So we cannot alienate them, but we have to persuade them that it's better for them to be public citizens and put people before profit.
Kristalina, I promised to come back to you. I want to get your perspective on the idea that the developing world will go ahead and provide booster shots when the developing world is in such dire need. It has, though, been a year since South Africa and India first called for the suspension of intellectual property protection on vaccines and related technologies. And this is something Ngozi has just been alluding to. The UK, Norway, Switzerland and the EU are still blocking the waiver needed to make that happen. Do you and do your fellow leaders here today call on countries to back this proposal, at least until the fight against the pandemic is over?
At the IMF, we actually researched the question of production versus availability. And the answer is production capacity can deliver doses for countries that still don't have it, and it can deliver boosters. The problem is to prioritize delivery for those who do not yet have access to vaccines. And for that purpose, what we are pressing for, actually all four of us, is disclosure of contracts, transparency of who bought what for what delivery date, and is this a good match of the objective we presented, vaccinate at least 40% of the world population by the end of this year. And I can tell you that in our view, that transparency of contracts and delivery schedules is going to go a long way to optimize the production capacity. I want to make two more points on the question of do we want to see more self-reliance? The answer is yes. We are very keen that this crisis turns into an opportunity for Africa to be more self-reliant. And in fact, I was very pleased to learn from Senegal that they're going to use a portion of the special drawing rights we have allocated to Senegal exactly for this purpose. Our assessment is that if African countries take 1 billion of the special drawing rights to move it towards expanding production, it can do a lot of good for the future. And my second point is to be clear that yes, we do need more collaboration on all fronts. Ngozi is the expert on the trade issue, so I don't want to jump into her field, but the simple final point I want to make here, Becky, is that we are so much in this together, we can get out of it only together.
David, the World... Yeah, no, you make a very good point. David, the World Bank has deployed over $157 billion to fight the impact of the pandemic. This is, as I understand it, the largest ever crisis response. I just want our audience here to get a sense of what financing instruments you've used and what have been the results. What's the learning here?
This is a mix around the world of loans and grants, and it goes to health, it goes to education, it goes to governments when they're making positive changes in their laws that make them more attractive for business, for setting up vaccine operations. Part of that $157 billion is the supply of vaccines. So IFC, our private sector arm, invests debt and equity in vaccine manufacturing in Africa, and we're helping expand the Aspen Pharmaceutical in South Africa, and we're helping research other sites where vaccine manufacturing can occur. So there's a range of investments made in development from that $157 billion. And remember, it's leveraged from donors. So donors put money in, and we borrow heavily against it in capital markets. So it brings in people from around the world together in sustainable development efforts. Climate is a core one that's expanding rapidly as well.
No, I understand that. Ngozi, I just want to come to you at this point. The WTO was created, of course, in 1995, in part to address how trade could be used to promote sustainable development. I just wonder, I mean, this is a question that I've been asked myself over the last 19 months, whether the WTO has actually failed low-income countries in this instance. And I just wonder what your response to that is.
I would say my response, Becky, is no. The WTO has not failed low-income countries in this instance. This is actually an opportunity, a time when the WTO and trade has responded very well. People do not know it, but you know, last year, as the value of trade fell by more than 7%, the value of medical supplies and products being traded rose by 16%, and personal protective equipment by 50%. What does this mean? That the WTO's, the trade backed by WTO's rules was actually moving goods around to where they were needed. Secondly, you mentioned the issue of the TRIPS. Earlier on, you talked about the TRIPS waiver and the IP. Of course, it's a WTO agreement. More than 100 countries are asking, or members are asking for a waiver of the intellectual property rights so that they can have access to this to manufacture vaccines. We have other members who think that this will, if you do this, it will get in the way of innovation. So what are we trying to do? Actually, there's an emerging consensus from all members now, after a lot of debate and discussion, that we need a solution to the IP problem, that people are dying, it's unconscionable, we should not solve this. So as I speak to you, there are discussions going on for a pragmatic solution, and I think we will get it, Becky, that will allow developing countries access to know-how, technology transfer, and then at the same time, in a way that will assure those who have developed these vaccines that they will be protected. We are not going to disincentivize research and innovation.
Ngozi, with respect, there will be people who will be quite cynical about what that solution might look like. So can you just explain what you think it might look like?
Becky, you know, this is something being discussed at the moment by members. So I cannot say what the ultimate solution will be. But I want to say that I'm pretty sure it will allow better access than we have now from some provisions in our TRIPS agreement and make it easier for countries to get access. We have to find a way of bridging this gap. And really, we all agree it is not right that people should be dying. We need to make sure that technology is transferred, that developing countries can manufacture. I can't put on the table now because they're negotiating it at this moment. So I can't tell you the ultimate answer, but I know it will come out to a pragmatic place.
Well, that's good to hear, and I hope you will join us on. Go on, Tedros. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So on IP, I think the IP waiver would be very important. And as global community, we should ask ourselves, why do we have even the IP waiver as a legal instrument if we're not going to use it in such unprecedented condition, situation? This pandemic happened more than 100 years after the 1918 flu. And the provision in the TRIPS agreement was made in order to use it in such situations, in emergencies. So how can we say this should be an issue for debate? When are we going to use, the provision? If we cannot do it, use it now. I mean, my response is we should use IP waiver now. We should waive it because these are unprecedented times. And then the other thing I would like to raise here is we have spoken to some countries who are not supporting IP waiver and spoken to manufacturers. Their response is, even if we waive IP, it will not be useful unless it's accompanied by technology transfer. Our response was, okay, if what you're saying is the problem, then why not you just waive and let's try it if, it works or not? Because without trying, you wouldn't know. But when you talk about technology transfer, once you open or waive IP, it can trigger technology transfer because those people who are working for those who control the IP will be free, since it will be legalized, will be free to migrate and help others. Or they can work part-time to transfer technology. So it can happen if the IP is waived. And the other is, as Ngozi said, I fully agree, we need incentives for the private sector. We need to appreciate their role because they have developed these vaccines in less than a year. So in order not to affect the incentives for the long term, the waiver could be for a very limited period of time. It could be 2 years or 3 years or until the end of the pandemic. And it could focus on vaccines only. But, not waiving it now,
I understand,
when the situation is unprecedented and the emergency is clear and the whole world is the hostage of this virus, if we cannot waive it now, then when? To be honest, this is really something where I can say humanity is failing miserably. And this is not acceptable. It's in the interest of the manufacturers. It's in the interest of each and every country in the world to waive IP, do everything to increase production and end this pandemic as soon as possible and open up the world and release.
Well, you heard that from the head of the WHO.
Could I just add to that? Just quickly, one word. We've been talking about waiving this IP. And I think that has brought people to the table. I think let us, in a short while, hopefully, maybe by our 12th ministerial, which starts at the end of November, both sides are talking to each other and they should come up with a solution that will give us light on this problem.
Well, let's hope that happens, Ngozi.
One word.
Go on, Kristalina.
If I may, just to say that Tedros touched on something very important. It is the waiver, but then it is the technology, and it is the skills and the capacity to build that self-reliance. And they have to all go hand in hand. I'm actually encouraged to listen to some of the scientists and some of the manufacturers that are recognizing this is a terrible pandemic, may not be the last one. And if the world is to build strength, capacity to face health risks in the future, now is the time to approach this in a comprehensive manner. We need resilience. We need resilience for shocks to come.
And I do want to talk about that preparedness with all of you as we close out this extremely interesting session tonight. Before I do that, it will come as no surprise to any of you that we are not only dealing with the pandemic, but also an infodemic and a low level of trust in big societal institutions, such as the ones that you are leading. Kristalina, I'm going to start with you because just last night, the IMF board affirmed its full confidence in your leadership after investigating your conduct while at the World Bank related to data regarding China's economic performance. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that decision and ask you whether you think this episode has further eroded trust in institutions such as the IMF and entangled you personally in the wider geopolitical rivalry between the US and China.
Becky, I'm so glad you asked. The board of the IMF, in a comprehensive and impartial process, reviewed the evidence, and it concluded that it has full confidence in my leadership at the IMF. So I can rally the fabulous staff of the IMF, work with our partners, those who are on this panel, to address the tough challenges we face. We talk about the pandemic, we have climate, we have the issue of inequality. And of course, I take it to heart that we have to strive always to demonstrate that what we do touches positively the lives of people. And I take pride of what we have done at the IMF in these 2 years to mobilize incredibly strongly to help our members. And I'm confident that you would see the IMF to be that beacon of integrity of our data and research, as we have always been. You're right, we have to always work for the public trust. And that's what I have been doing for 40 years.
And you've been asking for accountability and transparency tonight on this very panel. David, I have to come to you. The credibility of international organizations has been eroded due to various controversies, not least that of the IMF or the World Bank and the issue that we've just been discussing with Kristalina. Does this trust need to be rebuilt, sir?
I'm looking forward to strong collaboration continued with IMF, with Kristalina, with Ngozi and Tedros. And one thing I would say is, you have with you today four really hardworking public officials that are watched every hour, every day, every week, so we're working hard in order to get the job done. I know my day is full of chances to try to make a difference and to help people, and I look forward to having as much integrity, accountability in all of those affairs as we can. World Bank's doing quality research into the future, and it's vital as part of the development effort.
What are the learnings out of this episode, David?
Learning is constantly review the quality of your products, make them better, build them hard, and keep focused on getting good development outcomes for countries.
How do we prepare for future potential crises? Ngozi?
And I was going to say preparedness is a core part of World Bank and of IDA. We fast-tracked front-loaded our IDA into the crisis, and that's been vital in delivering as many programs as we have.
Ngozi.
Yeah, Becky, thank you. Actually, to prepare for the next crisis, I have to tell you, the G20 finance ministers set up a task force to look into this. And this was co-chaired by myself, by Larry Summers and Tharman Shanmugaratnam, the senior minister of Singapore. And we found 4 major gaps in pandemic preparedness. We found that there's a gap in globally networked surveillance and research to prevent and detect emerging infectious diseases. We found a second gap in resilient national systems. That means that our health systems, when this happened, were just not prepared, both in rich and poor countries. We found that there was not an adequate supply of medical tools and countermeasures to deal with this pandemic. And as we've just been talking, also inequity of access. The world was not prepared for access to this. And the last gap was in global governance. There just wasn't the mechanism to coordinate all the different organizations to make sure that funding came on time and that the international financial architecture worked. And there was no organization to really be accountable for all the outcomes. We made 3 recommendations to be prepared, and I'll be very fast. One is that we all have to increase spending domestically to strengthen our health systems. In low-income countries and middle-income countries, we've actually suggested 1 percentage point of GDP extra in spending over the next 5 years in order to be prepared. In addition to this, we are also saying we need increased international spending because there's a public good aspect to managing the pandemic. We've recommended $75 billion over the next 5 years, 15 billion a year, of which 10 billion should go into a global health threats fund. And finally, we've recommended improved global governance, a global health threats fund, a global health threats board that would oversee and coordinate our preparedness for the next pandemic and the spending.
Tedros, I do want to get your perspective. I've also got a question from an interested audience member watching this discussion who says the WHO is at the forefront of global health. And Renee asks, will COVID lead to the reform of management and investment in medical and health research?
The answer is yes, it will. As I said earlier, this pandemic is unprecedented, and we're documenting all lessons that we need to learn, part of it which Ngozi said, and all these recommendations should be implemented. I think this will help us if we can, learn from this pandemic properly and implement the recommendations. The world will be different, and we can be better prepared. One thing I would like to add to this is the pandemic treaty will be very important, or pandemic agreement. We have seen many challenges that could have been addressed if we had a framework or a legal instrument that could guide us. So that would be very key, by the way, in the change we will have to prepare the world in a better way, the pandemic treaty or pandemic agreement.
Kristalina, finally, I just want to come to you. You came to the IMF wanting to talk about gender pay parity, doing more to tackle the climate crisis, talking more about income equality. You couldn't have known quite what was coming down the pipe with regard the COVID pandemic. You've gone beyond this narrow focus and adopted a much more, as some would describe it, holistic approach. Which is exactly what many of us said that we needed. I wonder whether, to a certain extent, you feel as if that may be what got you into hot water recently, but also just get your perspective on ultimately what the learnings are here to ensure that we are more prepared for any eventualities going forward.
We are living in a fast-changing world, Becky, and we have to anticipate what next, and then have the agility to prevent crisis, to respond quickly, to target the most vulnerable. And to do so, as Ngozi was saying, across the board, we need to scan the horizon better. We have to have better monitoring of these risks. And then the extra capacity, if necessary, to step up. But above all, we need to work on countries to have strong institutions, educated people that are healthy, capable to adjust to these shocks, to care about the agility and capacity of our planet to absorb these shocks, and to be with institutions everywhere that have the skills to lead towards a more sustainable, more equitable future. What does it mean? If you compare with the pandemic, who did the pandemic hit the hardest? People with weak immune systems. The same way countries with weak institutions, with weak immune systems, get hit hardest. So working relentlessly to build that institutional capacity, to have development that gives jobs to people, makes them able to have good business opportunities. This is what matters. To turn it into the language of our conversation today, building resilience is about people, institutions, and our planet.
Having you all with us today has been extremely important. I know that the audience listening to this will have found this incredibly valuable. David, you're right. All of you are extremely hard workers. It is so important that the conversation is out there, that the challenges that you face are clear, and that the goals that you have set yourself with this multi-leader task force are clear and we hope achievable. We thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us today. It's been fascinating, and let's hope that we are not talking in 19 months' time about the very same issue of vaccine inequality, because that would be terrible. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, all of you. I'm Becky Anderson. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Becky. Good
Thank you,
night.
Becky.
Come and I'm so pleased that you coped with it as well as you did, and everybody else, thank you for everything and all your hard work, and you know you are always welcome here, and whatever we can do for you guys here on CNN and on my show, you know we're always here for you, so thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Becky.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you, Becky.
Bye, David.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
David.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good to see everybody.
Bye. Good to see you too.
Soon.
See you soon.